Hello and welcome to the Financing a Sustainable Future podcast, brought to you by the Initiative in Sustainable Finance, funded by the Global School of Sustainability here at LSE. I'm Tom Gosling, Professor in Practice and Director of the Initiative. This is a podcast where we talk to LSE academics about their research on sustainable finance in a way that is accessible for practitioners. Today I'm here with Ji Li, Associate Professor of Accounting at the London School of Economics and Political Science, to discuss her paper Co-ordinated Engagements, co-authored with Elroy Dimson from the University of Cambridge and Ojan Karakash from the University of Cambridge as well. Ji, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with the motivation behind this project. What's the gap in our understanding of shareholder engagement that you were looking to fill with this study?
Great question. There's been growing attention lately on how investors can drive change on big issues like climate change, workers' rights, and corporate ethics. Instead of just buying or selling stocks, more and more investors are using their power as shareholders to engage with companies directly and push for change. In recent years, we have seen the rise of major investor coalitions, groups like Climate Action 100+, or the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, where shareholders with shared goals team up to influence companies together. This kind of collective action can be really powerful, especially in a world where no single investor holds a big enough stake to make change alone. But many share common concerns like the need to address climate risk. But here's what we wanted to understand. How can these collaborative efforts be made more effective? What actually makes them work? In our study, we found that successful shareholder coalitions need structure. Especially, they need leadership. Just like any effective team or organization, having someone take the lead makes a real difference. We call this a two-tier structure, where there's a clear leader guiding the group's efforts. It might sound obvious. After all, every company or community group has leaders, but leadership in shareholder engagement hasn't been studied much before. Our research is really the first one to dig into this and test it with data. And what we found is that when a coalition has very strong leadership, its chances of successfully influencing a company go up significantly. We also look at what makes a good leader in this context. The good leaders tend to take the lead, and what makes them effective. These insights can help investors think more strategically about how to organize if they want their engagement efforts to truly make an impact.
That's a great kind of summary of everything you were trying to achieve here, and we'll dig into a number of those aspects in more detail during the conversation. Let's start with the setting. So you use engagements coordinated through the UN PRI. Can you describe how these engagements work and the data set that you used for the study?
Yes, certainly. PRI is a global network of investors committed to responsible investing. They operate a platform that allows investors to collaborate in engaging with companies on environment, social, governance issues. And a subset of these engagements are actually coordinated by the PRI staff, which act as a facilitator. We study roughly 31 of these coordinated engagement campaigns conducted over 10 years, targeting nearly 1,000 companies across 63 countries. And each engagement campaign, we can observe the topic, the target company, and the investors involved. So on average, each engagement includes about 26 investors from different countries. In total, we have about 224 investment organizations participating across all engagements, and they include investment managers, asset owners, service providers. It is a really rich data set.
It's absolutely enormous data set by the sound of things. And I mean, you analyse factors that lead to successful engagements. What's the definition of success? Is it at the initiative level or the firm level? Can you give some examples of that?
Success in our context actually means that engagement achieved its specific goals. For example, getting a company to improve its sustainability reporting, commitment to a global initiative, or disclose certain practices. The PRI actually tracked these goals carefully, project by project and target company by company. So the success is really measured at the target company and engagement level. And we found that roughly 53% of engagements in our sample were successful, but that number varies a lot, widely depending on how engagement was structured, for example, across single tier versus two-tier structure.
We'll come back to that single versus two-tier because it's one of the most important insights, I think, from the study. But just before we get to that, could you say a bit about the characteristics of the firms that are subject to these engagements and also of the investors that get involved in the engagements?
Certainly. It's a very good question. We look at relative to their peers from the same country and industry. The target firms in our sample actually tend to be larger and they have better ESG ratings. This is suggesting that those coordinated engagements in our sample are actually targeting industry leaders rather than laggards. So this actually aligns with PRI's proactive approach of identifying emerging ESG issues for improvement. And we also find that target firms have a higher percentage of their public equity held by the engagement team, so indicating greater skin in the game. So in terms of the characteristic of investors, we look at the collaborating investors that participate in the collaborative engagement, and they are more likely to be organizations, investment organizations, with a strong intrinsic interest in ESG, such as pension funds, PRI founding members, and investors based in countries with very strong social norms around sustainability. So one interesting finding relative to the organization size is that we find mid-sized investors actually more likely to collaborate. And this is because larger investors might prefer to engage independently alone, while smaller ones, they lack the resources even to engage to start with. So investor size appear to reflect both the capacity to engage and the willingness to collaborate.
Let's come on now to something that you've mentioned briefly a couple of times, which is this sort of difference between two-tier and single-tier engagements, which is a really crucial distinction in your study. First of all, can you explain this difference and the history of these engagement types within PRI?
Yes. Initially, when PRI started this collaborative coordinated engagement, and all the investors were equal parties. So that's what we call single-tier structure. All the investors participate equally, and there's no designated leader. And in a two-tier structure, which actually PRI started experimenting this structure since 2010, and then adopted them more systematically in later years. So in a two-tier structure, there's a designated leader, or sometimes a couple, or even more, and who will take on more responsibility. They organize, they communicate with the target companies, and they keep things moving. So other investors who are not leader, we call them supporting investors, they will play a much more supportive role. Nevertheless, they still exert effort and give their resources to the leaders.
So let's come on to some of the key results now. Can you tell us what the base rate engagement success rates were in the study and then how these improved for two-tier versus single-tier engagement? That's quite a striking result, I think.
Indeed. So the average success rate, if we look at our single-tier engagements, is roughly 33%. But for two-tier engagement in our sample, it rises to 73%. Of course, these are just averages. They don't take into account other factors, for example, the composition of the investor team or the characteristics of the target firms and where they are located. However, even after we take into account all these factors, we find that by just having a two-tier engagement structure, this can improve success rate roughly by 23 to 31%. So this is a substantial improvement by having a leader in the team.
So given the importance of leaders, maybe you can say a little bit more about the characteristics of investors that become leaders in these engagements, and also what are some of the key characteristics that are associated with successful engagements?
So roughly we have 200 plus collaborating investors in our sample, and only 90 of them ever took a leadership role. So this suggests that leadership is not for everyone. It is extremely resource intensive and require both credibility and capacity because the followers need to trust you, right? We find that leaders often have a dedicated internal team for engagement, and they also tend to be very active in other collaborative initiatives beyond PRI. So this is really consistent with the theoretical idea of leading by example. And also, leaders are much more likely to be from the same country as a target firm. This is very interesting, and we think this is likely driven by three factors. First one is home bias. Right? Leaders are more inclined to engage on ESG issues closer to home. Second one is the lower engagement cost because of geographically and culturally they are closer to the target firm. If you are going to have meetings, and you can have face-to-face meetings much in a lower cost. Right? You can also better understand the cultural cultural difference and understand the language the management speak. And lastly, we think it's about the superior local knowledge. Again, this is also related to the previous point, that being local, they can understand the management more, they can understand, they can have more connections potentially to push for changes. So another important thing we notice is leaders tend to have larger holdings in the target firm. Again, this is about skin in the game, right? Yeah. This will make the effort of leading an engagement more worthwhile. And also, we will look at the effectiveness of having a leadership. We find that leaders with information advantage and reputational credibility, they could contribute to the success of the engagements. So in other words, when leaders are better informed and more respected, those two-tier engagement structure actually are much more likely to succeed.
So a common concern is that engagement is prone to free rider effects, whereby one firm engages but all investors benefit. One intriguing result you found is that there are fund flow benefits to lead investors that provide an incentive to engage. Can you just unpack that a bit?
Yes, indeed. The free riding problem exists not only between engaging and non-engaging investors, but also between leading and supporting investors, because leaders, they have to contribute significant more effort and resources, right? So we hypothesize that future fund flows, that is the amount of capital that investors can attract from their clients, may serve as a key financial incentive for both collaboration and leadership. And we do find supporting evidence. We find that both collaboration and leadership experience are associated with increased future fund flows. In other words, there's a reputational payoff that helps offset the cost of engagements.
One of the things that comes out very strongly from your study is the importance of these collaborative efforts as a way of enabling investors who are individually too small to influence to collectively have some sort of impact on these environmental and social outcomes. So what do you think the implications are of the sort of drawing back from investor alliances that we're seeing at the moment in response to political pressure?
That is a thought-provoking question. So we do observe a lot of fund managers withdrawing from investor coalitions like Climate Action 100+. So I think potential issue is greenwashing. Concern is greenwashing, right? For example, if you join PRI, but you do not really engage effectively, you don't exert resources, it's just having a name on it, and then this invites greenwashing concern and reputational damage. So somehow firms, when they think they are not able to engage actively, play the active ownership role, so they withdraw in order to avoid the greenwashing criticism. And another thing is, I think particularly for large asset managers, for example, BlackRock and Vanguard, that although they are PRI signatories, but they are not in our sample. This is because, as we mentioned earlier, right, because they are extremely large asset managers, they don't need to collaborate with others, and also they have different departments, such as fixed income. They face potential conflicts of interest within the organization. Therefore, they are worried about active engagement on the equity side might potentially damage, raises concern of conflicts of interest.
Oh, that's fascinating. So they didn't even appear in the study as investors engaged. Yeah. That's really interesting. Well, I mean, I think there's a lot to come still on this whole question of shareholder collaboration. Thanks for a great discussion. I mean, you've written a couple of the seminal studies on the impact of investor engagement on sustainability. So it's great to have had the chance to speak to you about your work today.
Thank you, Tom, for having me.
You've been listening to the Financing a Sustainable Future podcast with me, Tom Gosling. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like, share and subscribe on your favourite platform. To find out more about the work of the Initiative in Sustainable Finance, which is funded by the Global School of Sustainability here at LSE, please go to fmg.ac.uk/ISF.